My first full-time job was in a kitchen in Germany on a work exchange program. And on one of my very first days on the job, a coworker asked me, "Kannst du eine Zwiebel holen?" So for some of you, there will be no mystery here, but for me at the time, fresh out of college and with no German to speak of, I had absolutely no way to parse my coworker's request to fetch her an onion. I got off shift that day and just wept with frustration because I was absolutely capable of doing the tasks in that kitchen. I just didn't have the tools I needed to get the jobs done. 15 years later, I stood on a train station platform in Japan with an enormous suitcase packed full of gifts for friends I hadn't seen in about a decade. And as I stood there, I realized there was a problem because I was going to have to lug this enormous suitcase over a huge flight of stairs that went over the tracks and out. There was no elevator. And I remember standing there and feeling first shock, but then also shame. Because how many times had I stood in this exact spot and never realized that the station was wheelchair inaccessible? So in both these environments, everyone was being treated the same. That is, we were all being treated equally. But equitable treatment, in which everyone gets the tools they need to access a space, well, that would have looked really different. What if the German kitchen lead had printed out an illustrated poster of kitchen vocabulary for the American trainees? What if the train station had installed an elevator? Not coincidentally, both of those interventions that I just described would be primarily considered useful for folks with various types of disabilities. But I, too, as a non-disabled user of those spaces, would have been saved so much effort and heartache if the spaces had been designed more accessibly. Accessible design helps everyone. We actually call this phenomenon the curb cut effect, because curb cuts, which are installed in sidewalks for the use of folks in wheelchairs, are also really, really helpful for folks pushing baby strollers, folks whose knees are acting up, even folks on rollerblades. When we design our environments universally, taking everyone's access needs into account, the entire community benefits. Today I work as a librarian, and I think about accessibility and curb cuts a whole lot in my day-to-day. I am the library director at the University of Arizona Poetry Center, one of the largest poetry collections in North America. And we have been taking a really hard look lately at the accessibility of our materials. We've been asking ourselves, who can access these collections and who can't? For those who can't, what can we do to connect with those communities and serve them better? So as we did this work of examination, we discovered that one of our collections was not quite as accessible as we could make it. That collection is called VOCA. VOCA is an online archive of recordings of poetry readings that the Poetry Center has hosted here on campus over the decades. The entire archive has been digitized for the web with permission of the authors, and it is a treasure trove. On VOCA, you can find more than 800 poets reading thousands and thousands of poems. With a click of a button on VOCA, you can time travel from a recording made in the 1960s to one made as recently as last week. But when we first did the work to digitize this collection and describe it for web access, we did not initially caption the recordings. And this meant that at first, the archive was accessible only to users who could hear. So that's a problem. But we're not alone in this problem. In libraries in the last 20 years, we've seen a real push to digitize historical literary recordings to make them more accessible to the public. But up until the pandemic, we were not really seeing a parallel push to transcribe and caption those recordings to make them more universally accessible. And so, sorry, a little bit nervous here, make them more universally accessible. So the Poetry Center wanted to be part of changing that. In 2021, I made a first-of-its-kind proposal to the Mellon Foundation to fund professional transcription and captioning for the entire archive, with the Poetry Center's library staff carefully proofreading the results to capture poetry's idiosyncrasies. About 3 years and thousands of staff hours and about 6 million words later, we have finished that project, and I'm delighted to report that we are already seeing the curb cut effect in action because captions give all VOCA users a really richer experience of the archive. So it's easy to see why captions are necessary. Just flip on your TV and hit the mute button. It's almost impossible to follow uncaptioned video without sound. Captions are, of course, a crucial accommodation for the 11 million Americans who are deaf or hard of hearing. And by the way, about half the population is going to start losing hearing as we age, so get ready. But captions serve a wealth of other benefits too. For one thing, captions have been widely shown to boost comprehension of audio content across the board for everyone. And that is, I find, particularly important for an archive of poetry, because poetry thrives on surprises. For example, check out this vocal recording of our current US poet laureate, Ada Limon.
What I didn't know before was how horses simply give birth to other horses. Not a baby by any means, not a creature of liminal spaces, but a four-legged beast hell-bent on walking, scrambling after the mother. A horse gives way to another horse, and then suddenly there are two horses. Just like that. That's how I loved you. You off the long train from Red Bank, carrying a coffee as big as your arm, a bag with two computers swinging in it unwieldily at your side. I remember we broke into laughter when we saw each other. What was between us wasn't a fragile thing to be coddled, cooed over. It came out fully formed, ready to run.
So I bet we were not expecting a love poem to come out of that horse, huh? The captions on that file really help us to follow her as she takes that hard left turn in the middle of the poem. And what a delight it is to follow her there. Captions are also incredibly useful to students of second languages. When we first start to study a second language, we often have difficulty following the speed at which native speakers speak. Captions help with that too. For example, check out Francisco X. Alarcón reading one of his children's poems in Spanish.
Cuando digo México, oigo a mi abuela hablándome de los aztecas y de la ciudad que fundaron en una isla en medio de un lago. México, me dice mi abuela, significa del ombligo de la luna. No olvides tu origen, mi hijo. Quizás por eso mismo, cuando ahora digo México, quiero tocarme el ombligo.
I love this poem, but I'm a student of Spanish. I'm not a fluent speaker. And so for me, the captions on that file make the difference between getting a little lost in the middle and being utterly charmed. VOCA also has a particularly rich collection of recordings of indigenous poets reading their work. And what that means is that the captions on those files can become tools to help document indigenous languages of the Southwest. For example, here we have renowned poet and linguist Ofelia Zepeda reading in her native O'odham.
Nyanya ihashagi. Haka chikanyanya mamkai takim amkai takim tashut nigoi. Amkai takim siarik tagyo. Amkai takim jupin tagyo. Amkai takim wakarim tagyo. Amachai chukit shagid mamkai takim.
So we can see how the captions on that file help to document the look as well as the sound of the beautiful O'odham language. Finally, for the digital humanities scholars among us, when we go through and caption a historical archive of recordings, we open them up to really exciting new possibilities for linguistic analysis. I wonder what we could learn, for example, by pinpointing the most commonly used word on VOCA by decade. What could that tell us about the obsessions of the culture in the last century? So I know that some folks will look at a project like this and think, well, this all sounds great, but how are we possibly going to afford captioning all of our historical audio? And I will say to that having done this project, having seen the results, we can't afford not to do this. The benefits are enormous and the funding exists. We're incredibly grateful to the Mellon Foundation for their enthusiastic partnership on this project. The other question that I get asked very frequently about this project is, yeah, but wasn't that a ton of work? It sure was. The Poetry Center library staff has spent a ton of time on this project, and our time could not possibly have been better spent. If our work can make poems accessible to more people, that's a gift that we get to give the community. So a number of libraries and literary centers around the country are working just like us to digitize their own priceless, unique literary recordings to make them more accessible for the public. And I would encourage my colleagues who are working in this space to think of digitization as just your first step. Because digitization alone does not make these recordings truly accessible. Captions are a curb cut that is required to really open these recordings up to more uses by more people. And we know that we're not done with VOCA. We know that as the technology and as our understanding of universal design evolve, we're going to find more curb cuts to build, more we can do to connect people with poems. And that really matters to me. Because I think we need poetry more than we sometimes realize. After all, what do we do in the moments that mean the most to us? In times of national crisis, at weddings, at funerals? We reach for poems. We read them aloud to each other. We share them on social media. Poetry connects us. Poetry helps us belong. The great James Baldwin puts it this way. You read something which you thought happened only to you, and you discover that it happened 100 years ago to Dostoevsky. This is a very great liberation for the suffering, struggling person who always thinks that he's alone. This is why art is important. Imagine a future in which everyone, no matter where we live, what our physical abilities are, or what language we speak, has equitable access to the art and literature in our libraries, archives, and museums. That's the future we're building toward. Thank you so much.